Good afternoon, everybody. Uh, Welcome to a forum that was supposed to have taken place in February and unfortunately got shifted by bad weather, but thank you all for coming today. Our subject is uh, Saudi Arabia and from two aspects, its role as a leader of the oil market and Saudi oil policy is the main entry point, which is why we're offering this under our ERE, Energy Resources and Environment Program. But we also want to talk a little bit about some of the domestic reform process in Saudi Arabia and get some views about where that stands and where that might be going. Uh, we have two speakers. Dr. Jean-François Sesnek is an adjunct professor here at SAIS in the Middle East program and also teaches at Georgetown. His specialty for quite some time is business and finance issues in the Middle East. And he's just alerted me that he's published a book very recently on the financial markets of the Arab Gulf. He's a political scientist who has specialized in this political economy dimension of the Middle East for some time. And he has been a visiting professor full-time at Georgetown for some 10 years in the early part after the year 2000 at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He's also taught at Columbia University, and he's the founder of his own little consulting group called the Lafayette Group. But he's also spent time in the Middle East, and actually, I believe, lived there for some 10 years or more, again, involved in international banking and finance. Dr. Sesnek has a PhD from Yale University and other degrees from Yale, but also has degrees, MA in International Affairs from Columbia and a BA from Washington College. So we welcome you.
Thank you very much. For the record, I'm no longer at Georgetown, actually. Yeah, I'm only at SAIS. So, thank you very much, Will. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to talk about Saudi Arabia, and we're very lucky because we have my old cohort here, Farid Mohammadi, whom I've known for God knows, we don't even want to mention it. But we've done a lot of work on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, on the Gulf in general, all over the world. And so it's a pleasure to check my ideas with his. And they're not always the same, which is rather really good for you guys. But in any event, let me just talk a little bit about what I see as Saudi policy these days. You know the old story about the blind people who feel an elephant. You know, each one feels a leg and somebody feels the trunk, and everybody thinks it's a forest when it happens to be an elephant, right? So it's a little bit, the Saudi policy is a little bit like this. Everybody knows a little bit of the policy, but it's very hard to know what is the policy in the end. So what has been very interesting lately, though, is that there has been major efforts by the Minister of Energy, Khaled Al-Faleh, who used to be, of course, the Saudi Aramco chief executive, who has a very long career in Saudi Aramco. He's an engineer by trade, and he knows his business. There's no doubt about that. He also, in my own opinion, and I think we probably will discuss that with Farid to a great extent, but he's one of the strongest persons in the kingdom today because he's one of the people with a real vision of where to take the kingdom in the future. So when he talks today, Khaled Al-Faleh, people listen to him. And what he has been discussing lately a lot is to take Saudi Aramco much more international than it is today. Saudi Aramco, of course, is the largest producer of oil. Well, it used to be the largest producer of oil, and it's the third after the US and Russia. But it still produces almost 10 million barrels per day. And it is also going downstream very rapidly. And that is really one of the main policies of of Saudi Arabia, and certainly of Saudi Aramco in any case, is to go downstream. Now, why do they, by downstream, I mean going to refining and going into the refining from the refining. In other words, they take the, you know, when you refine, you get diesel fuel, you get gasoline, diesel fuel, and kerosene and naphtha, and many other things. But if you go from the naphtha, you can refine the naphtha further with an aromatics plant, and you get basically all the components of petrochemicals. And Saudi Aramco is going in a big way downstream. Now, they also have started two very large joint venture firms in Saudi Arabia. One is Sadara, which is a Saudi Arabian Dow Chemical, well, it's now Dow DuPont, it's called, company, which is very much in advanced chemicals. They are making, you know, the normal petrochemicals, LDPE and so on, but they're also making mostly MDI, methyl diisocyanates, which are extremely high value products and very difficult to make. And the MDI plant at Sadara is the only one in the Middle East, and it's going to be the only one in the Middle East for a long time because it's a very difficult product to make, but it has a lot of value to it. And that's the kind of things they're going into. And they're going further down than that. They're trying to establish big industrial firms based on Sadara, and now also next to Sadara, there's the Total refining plant of 400,000 barrels a day, very advanced refining, and they're going to also go into chemicals in the very near future. And they've started a very large, like 50 square kilometer industrial zone right there where they're bringing people from all over the world to add value to their carbon molecules. So they're doing this not just in Saudi Arabia. They also are trying to expand their refining. There has been a policy of Saudi Arabia stated of going into 10 million barrels a day of refining, which is quite large considering they produce 10 million barrels now. You know, they will buy some and sell some and so on. But they are planning, they already have about 3.5 million barrels a day of their own, in their own name, 5 million altogether in joint ventures in Saudi Arabia. They also have the largest refining company in the refinery in the United States is owned by Saudi Aramco. It's in Louisiana, I think, or in Texas, Louisiana. Anyway, it's in the south. And they have two large ventures in China. They have 650,000 barrels of refining capacity in Korea, which is just enormous. They have a big refining capacity now in Indonesia, which was just started this year. They are negotiating to have further refining capacity in India, which is really their biggest project right now. So they're going downstream from that. And the big difference with what they used to do in the past is that they were going to take these refineries and take the products from these refineries and go downstream into chemicals as well. Okay. The idea is that they want to add value to their carbon molecules, really. In a way, judging from what Khaled Al-Faria was saying, is that they want to actually become an international oil company a little bit like ExxonMobil. And, but ExxonMobil does not produce 10 million barrels a day. In other words, they'd be about 3 times the size of ExxonMobil, which is the largest oil company in the world today. And you just wonder, why do they want to do this? And what else do they need to do this? Well, one thing which we will probably talk about later on in this program is the fact that Saudi Aramco is also now, has set its sight on becoming a gas company. Now, Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabia today is the 8th largest producer of gas in the world, but it is not considered to be a gas company, gas country, because the gas they produce is mostly associated from the oil they produce. They do have a few dry gas fields, which they are expanding today, But these are expensive gases. The gas in Saudi Arabia, the dry gas, is very rich in hydrogen sulfide, which means, you know, if you smell it, you die, type things. It is a very dangerous type of product, and it costs a lot of money to actually make it usable. But they have established very large companies to do that. But this is really an expensive gas. You know, the US today, gas is at $2.70 a million BTU. The cost of the gas at Saudi Aramco today, the dry gas, I'm not sure how much it is. It could be as high as $6 a million BTU just to get it out of the ground and used. So it is expensive. So they're now looking to go outside Saudi Arabia because they're not bringing in gas to Saudi Arabia. Nobody's importing gas into Saudi Arabia, but nobody's exporting gas from Saudi Arabia. And so right now it's self-sufficient, but they always are looking for more gas because the population is increasing. They need gas to create more electricity, more water desalination, and also to go more into chemicals. So they do need the gas very badly. Where would they get the gas? Well, there has been a lot of efforts by the Saudis lately to make friends with the Russians, as you may have noticed today. OPEC and Saudi Arabia and OPEC are getting together to sort of try to limit production, and the Russians, as we know, always promise to cut production. They promise. Not much more than that, but they promise to cut production, and the Saudis do cut production as well, and they have this month, they have cut quite a bit. But there has been large agreements signed by Saudi Aramco, or by the Minister of Energy, mostly, and Novatek of Russia to invest in LNG plants in the Yamal Peninsula in the north of Russia. So this is an interesting approach because it means that Saudi Arabia wants to learn about LNG, the liquid natural gas production. And I think they're going to make a big effort to that. There has been some rumors in the press that the US, the Saudis will also try to buy gas reserves, gas real estate, if you like, in the United States, and maybe a company in the United States that would have some knowledge of liquid natural gas as well. So they're working really hard to go into gas. Now, why are they doing that as well? I mean, frankly, what's the advantage to them? Well, I don't really know, but I have, of course, my little theory on that, which I will expand on. I think one of the problems has to do with, or not the problems, one of the reasons they're trying to expand their international approach to oil and gas is so that they are viewed by the markets as an international oil company and not just a national oil company. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that of all the national oil companies, except Statoil, Saudi Aramco is the best managed, and because it is managed, it does research, and it is pretty, very straightforward. But there has been a lot of talks about having a public offering of Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia and in New York or in London or Hong Kong, we don't really know. But there has been a lot of delays on that. And I think that the efforts of Saudi Aramco and the Ministry of Energy in Saudi Arabia to go international is really so that if they can be compared to a large international oil company like ExxonMobil or Shell or BP, then the markets, the international financial markets, may see them as being worth what an international oil company is. In other words, when people want to buy shares of Saudi Aramco, they will look at the price of the shares in terms of multiples of earnings, which is what most investment bankers would do. And if you do the multiple of earnings of ExxonMobil for the past 25 years, it goes up and down and up and down. Right now, it's pretty far down for some reason, but 6 months ago, it was 25. So I've made the computations actually over a period of like 20 years or so, and I found that the average multiple was 24 for most of the large international oil companies. So that if Saudi Aramco can show that they're like ExxonMobil except bigger and more profitable, then the markets will price them at 25, 24 times value of shares. And that means today a valuation of over $2 trillion because their net profit is probably around 75 million or so. So this is really what I think the purpose of that policy is, because in terms of actual gas, I'm sure they really don't need that much gas. They could always, God forbid, they could buy from Qatar, but we don't really talk about that. Or they could buy from Iran, not from Kuwait though, but from Iran maybe. But that's not going to happen either for the time being. But they could, if they are seen as an international oil company with gas and oil and chemicals, then they're worth their multiple. So maybe I should leave it at that and ask Farid to continue on this, and then we can answer all the questions you may have.
So we have as a second speaker slash commentator Farid Mohammadi, who for a long time was a member of the team of PFC Energy consulting firm here in Washington until it was bought out a few years back by IHS. And Farid developed a large country risk price analysis for the oil and gas industry, analyzed OPEC dynamics and national oil companies. He's broadly an international political economist, specializing in the geopolitics of energy and energy markets, but currently is working for a Chinese firm, and he's a managing director of SIA Energy, which is the global division of a firm that's based in Beijing. And he's advising China on developments in international markets and also examining the needs that China has for energy and how that relates to international markets. Farid has worked for a number of other companies, briefly at the Rapidan Energy Group here in Washington, but for 2 years or so, in 2014 and 16, he worked at Saudi Aramco, where he headed a group out of corporate planning, which was a support and industry analysis group. He's also worked briefly for Statoil, Moody's Investor Services, Wharton Econometrics, and the Ministry of Finance and National Economy of Bahrain. Farid has degrees from Georgetown University and also from Western Michigan University. Farid, let me invite you to come up, but I wonder if I could provoke you at the beginning to maybe branch out a little bit in the discussion, if you would, and say a little bit about Saudi Arabia and OPEC today and the whole issue of cooperating with Russia, possibly forming an alliance with Russia and other non-OPEC companies. Is that on or off? Where does that fit in?
Good evening. Actually, I had made some cheat notes. I must have read your mind, and to talk about OPEC and Saudi Arabia. I think let's start with 2014, because that was recent history, but oil prices were $100 for 3 years, and they crashed in 2014. And the market analysts, newspapers, et cetera, said, this is the end of OPEC. This is the end of Saudi Arabia is now just going to pursue a market share policy. And this, some of us who are old enough have seen this talked about and analyzed for many years. I mean, this was the chatter in 1986. This was the chatter in 1998. And then it came back in 2014. I've always said that actually Saudi Arabia, in fact, I argued this in the mid-90s, that Saudi Arabia never really was seriously about market share. It was always about maximizing its revenues. But it needed that market share statement to discipline OPEC. it was not going to take on all the burdens of managing the market. And in fact, when it did in the early 80s, its production fell in 1980 from 10 million barrels a day to 2 million barrels a day as it ceded space to other players who came on the market. And that was what led in 86 to Sheikh Zaki Yamani's netback pricing, where he basically he just raised production incredibly rapidly and trashed the price. And it concentrated the minds of OPEC, and everybody came together, and they all agreed that they would have an $18 price target. The target at that time, the naughty boys in OPEC, were Nigeria, Kuwait, that ultimately Kuwait led to the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. It did the same thing in 91 when Kuwait was coming back after liberation, and it destabilized markets, and the Saudis needed to slap the other OPEC members. And then it did it again in 98 when Venezuela was the naughty boy. And Luis Justi, I think he was a professor here at one time, the oil minister at that time wanted to take Venezuelan production to 6 million barrels a day. It had been 2 million. So it uses market share to discipline people. And again, in 2014, when the American surge took place, it said, Ali Naimi said, no, we're not going to accommodate, we're going to produce. And they went up to 10.7 million barrels a day, and prices went crashing down. It's particularly used by Saudi Arabia, this market share strategy, when supply surges happen. And those moments are the most unruly by OPEC, mainly because OPEC, especially the countries that have been damaged by war or embargo, the Iraqis, the Iranians, will say, no, you took our market share away while we were suffering. Why should we cut? You cut. You've been producing now at 10 plus for all these years, and we've been stuck in the gutter, basically. And there are times when the Saudis will play the market share just to chasten them, but in the end, right now, in my opinion, and for other reasons, market share is truly dead. And this is where the Saudis have started to reach out to non-OPEC countries and say, look, I think this is more serious. And I think the American threat has really concentrated the mind. This is a threat not like Norway in 99 or even non-OPEC coming on in the early 80s. That had a certain finiteness to it. This seems to have an infiniteness to it.
By threat, you mean the shale oil?
The shale oils, the US surge, seems to have, it's sort of the Energizer bunny. You know, you put a little bit of power in it and it'll go up 2.5 million barrels a day. And that, give it $70 oil and it goes up another 2 million barrels a day. So it almost seems incredibly frightening to the Saudis. And at this particular point, they really need high oil prices. They need high oil prices, ironically, for Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is about leaving oil, is to create an economy that's beyond oil. But in the meantime, they need the money to do their two big things with what Vision 2030 calls for. One is Aramco. As Jean-Francois said, the Aramco plans, yes, upstream, they're basically going to level out at 12.5 million barrels a day, but it takes a lot of money to maintain that capacity. And so that takes money. Other things that take money is downstream, as Jean-Francois said. They're going to buy refineries around the world. They've got already contracts to buy a refinery in Malaysia, a refinery in Indonesia, a huge refinery in India, 1.4 million barrels a day, several refineries in China, more. And so all of these are real money, 20 billion, $10 billion a pop. So that's going to be very expensive. SABIC, as you talked about, is going to cost them $70 billion. And I don't know how they will finance that. The first loan of tranche of 10 billion is coming on pretty soon. But if you borrow that type of money, you suddenly, as a sovereign, start to get into serious indebtedness. And I've calculated they borrow $70 billion right now. Their debt to GDP goes to 65%, which is pretty high. And then the gas, if they're going to buy a gas company, that also needs money. And you can borrow and you can finance and get creative and all that, but in the end, the problem with Saudi Arabia, on its way to create a sort of market economy and maybe a more buoyant export sector, is that you're still capped by oil revenues. Your revenues are still ultimately one commodity. So it's not like you're borrowing. Well, the only other country that I know of that borrowed its way to development rather than equity-ized its way to development is Korea. And Korea nearly failed. In 85, 86, if the yen had not been revalued, Korea would have been in deep trouble. As the yen went up, Korea became really competitive and took market share in the US. Anyway, so but that was a very different export model. The other reason, other than Aramco plans, that you need high oil prices is for macro stability in the economy. If MBS wants his future to be tied to the private sector, locally and foreign, you've got to show budgets which are stable, not what they did from 1982 to 1995, where they ran budget deficits equal to 16% of GDP every year, and took on 100% of GDP domestic debt, and they ran down their foreign assets from 182 billion to 45 billion in 95. So you can't do that again. You have to maintain a certain macro stability. And this little adventure from 2014 to today of having lower oil prices to play market share lost Saudi Arabia $200 billion. They had $740 billion in the bank, and they ran $100 billion current account deficits and this stuff, you know. And one of the things, back to the private sector financing, Saudi Arabia has a very volatile capital account of the balance of payments. So lots of money goes out because private sector can take money out. And so if you want to firstly depend on the private sector to bring money in, and secondly, if you don't keep macro stability, they'll take it out, which is even worse. So that's one thing. The second thing is that if you want your future economy to be run on foreign investment, FDI, foreign direct investment, you better have macro stability. Nerds like me study this and say this country is headed to a debt crisis. And so this sort of thing is very important. Rating agencies are watching. So anyway, so you need high oil prices for that. That's the absolute irony of that. The third reason, in my opinion, you need high oil prices and working with OPEC and all of that is the geopolitical ambitions of the Crown Prince. Guns cost money. Trump costs money, as he will show you on his board. So buying foreign friendship and foreign allegiances and alliances and all of that, guns, is expensive. So all of that. And, guns in Saudi Arabia have a very long tail. It's not just, I buy a plane today, and then I get to keep it in my closet. I buy a plane, but then it has a long tail of service sector support. And that costs, year on year, a huge amount of money. So that's also part of and ultimately, you need money for regime stability. And MBS has, for whatever reason, really shaken up the regime, which had been completely based on, one, a fairly unified ruling family that was, although shared out power, was very shared out, and created silos and ministries and was expensive to maintain, but at the top there was a certain level of stability. Now he's going for a more efficient government, a la authoritarian industrializing regimes, possibly in Asia, and he's looking for good management, stability. And in fact, if you look at the cabinet, there are very few royals in the cabinet. And so he's looking for a different type of system. But that has the dangers of creating regime instability. Secondly, he wants the domestic private sector, but he's, interestingly enough, attacked the domestic private sector, or what you call the domestic private sector, which is something I really did not understand. In sharp contrast to Putin, when Putin came to power in 2000, he gathered the oligarchs together, and he said, look, I know you guys stole this. Norilsk was bought for $150 million. It's a $50 billion nickel company, et cetera, et cetera. He said three conditions. Invest in Russia, pay your taxes, and no politics. And I would have thought that he would have gone, MBS would have gone with that type of deal with the old oligarchs, and then slowly transform them through incentives into maybe the new dynamic private sector he wanted. Instead, he went down for a shakedown up front, which means that he's not going to get that money. He maybe got $100 billion that they say, but he's not going to get the money in the future. And the local private sector is shocked to their back teeth and is saying, I'm not coming back because I don't know what the rules of the game are. The second thing is private sectors, the locals, always have very good foreign friends. Al-Walid has many foreign friends, etc. And I said, oh my God, this is a problem. So that too has created, in my opinion, an instability, his management style. Maybe all that will be solved over time. But I think that the three conditions that I consider for stability in the kingdom, a unified ruling family, for the first time in a long time, let's see, a disunited opposition, yes, pretty much, but there are some dynamics that could lead to some disaffected people in the business community, in the ruling family, to say, hey, let's rethink this deal. So I don't know, but I'm just conjecturing. And the third thing is, of course, a period of sufficient oil revenues to keep the whole system together. So back to you on OPEC, yes, very important to work together and keep the money flowing. One last thing, just on your point on, just saw a bunch of numbers today on imports, China imports to, foreign imports of oil to China. And very interesting, Russia raised, 2018, 2017, Russia raised its sales to China by 23%, so 270,000 barrels a day. Saudi Arabia went up, but only by 9%. Angola was down 4%. Iraq was up 23%. Brazil was up 39%. Kuwait was up 27%. Venezuela was down 25%. And it's ironic because Venezuela pays its debt in oil to the Chinese. So their just capacity is falling. And Libya was up 181% as it recovers. But, and the US was up 61% to China. Iran was stable at about 2%. And so it's really Venezuela's market share and the growth, the delta for the year, that the Saudis are conceding to the others. And they're keeping the market fairly tight. Anyway.
Okay, why don't we all go up here? So the floor is open for comments, questions.
We've stunned them into silence.
Thank you so much for being here. My question is.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, my name's Rebecca. I'm a first-year ERE student here at SAIS. My question is, MBS has spoken on opening up Saudi Aramco, opening up to putting it into one of the stock exchanges, or the stock markets. Do you suspect that this will ever happen in the future, and this is just an if Vision 2030 goes through, or do you think that this is more of a definite move towards opening up Saudi Aramco? Thank you.
And I'll start. I'm sure Farid has a lot to say about that as well. But, well, it depends what you hear. I mean, in January at the Atlantic Council Conference in Abu Dhabi, Khaled Al-Falih was sitting here, and we were all sitting there, and he said, the IPO will happen. And I've only heard Khaled Al-Falih speak about that, saying that it will happen. Now, will it happen? I don't really know, but if there's anybody that's believable, he would be. But there are a lot of, not everybody wants it to happen, definitely. And depending on whom you talk to, you'll hear, well, Khaled Al-Falih says he wants it to happen, but in fact he doesn't. And other people say exactly the opposite. So I have to take him at his word, though. He says his credibility is at stake. I think there are a lot of issues. Right now, they say that the IPO is being delayed because of the SABIC merger. SABIC is the large petrochemical company of Saudi Arabia. It's the fifth largest in the world in terms of sales and the first in terms of capitalization. And I'm not sure 100% that Saudi Aramco really wants SABIC. I was looking at that yesterday, and frankly, the kind of product lines which really would be attractive to Saudi Aramco are far and few in between. Now, Saudi Aramco will take it over because the owners of SABIC, which is mainly the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi Arabia, PIF, owns 70% of the shares, which is about $70 billion, as Farid mentioned. And Saudi Aramco has absolutely no clue how they're going to finance it. And even the $10 billion they said they would borrow next month, or maybe 11, we're not quite sure how much, but around there. I'm not sure it's meant for the SABIC purchase anyway, because they need to buy refining capacity elsewhere, the gas companies and whatnot. But they could take, if you look at SABIC from an investment banking standpoint, you could take SABIC and dismember it. And if you dismember it, maybe you could raise $10 to $20 billion. It's still short of $50 to $60 billion. So how they will finance that? They could, any good company today would do that, but they would issue shares. They would not buy it for cash. They would issue Saudi Aramco shares to PIF. PIF does not want shares, though. PIF wants cash. They want cash because it is now part of their pressure from the Crown Prince to really invest in high-tech companies, and they want to invest in all manners of things so they can bring the technology back to Saudi Arabia. But they need $70 billion. So there's absolutely no normal way that Saudi Aramco could borrow $70 billion today. I mean, the large international banks are happy to lend Saudi Arabia $10 billion, maybe another $10 billion, maybe another 10, but that's it. And it would be very bad for the credibility of Saudi Arabia if they had to borrow the full amount. So maybe what they will do is, as I said, take over SABIC, dismantle it, get some money out of that, and maybe buy it over time. Perhaps that's what they might want to do. But in terms of actually value, there isn't that much there. So in the end, the IPO will take place because I think it will take place at the multiple, as I said earlier, of about 24. That's really what they're looking for, I think. And that means a valuation of Saudi Aramco of $2 trillion, which is huge. Now, knowing they do that, they could then sell shares to Chinese companies. They could sell 1%. They could sell 1% to the Russians. It still have complete control by the Saudis, but it does bring in $20 billion at a pop for each percent. And that would make a little more sense in the end, and in the end, they may end up doing that. But we still have a ways to go. Khalid, I don't know what you think of this.
Well, when I was there in the last year, my last year there, they were definitely serious about it. The internal organizations were created to get ready to dress Aramco up, to go out on the marketplace. They were very, very serious about that. What I suspect happened, and also, by the way, I didn't mention that the oil price was not very good, and they managed the oil price to grow higher, partly because they wanted to make sure that it was high enough when they went on the market. And I should have actually mentioned that as one of the drivers of a higher oil price. What I think, well, they really wanted to list it on a very credible exchange. And New York being the best one, the deepest, London being second best. And they may have even listed parts of it on others. They talked about Hong Kong and Shanghai, and Tokyo, actually. But they really wanted the US. And I am wondering if the US problems were JASTA, which is the law that the victims of 9/11 can sue Saudi Arabian entities. And I think maybe they got cold feet because of that, the legal issues around that. I'm just speculating, but now, I do think that they can't have Vision 2030 without the sale of, without an IPO. They need the money for the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, so that it can go create that other part of the economy. Okay, and that's the sort of sovereign wealth fund that is mandated to do that. Aramco will always take care of the oil investments, but they need the money for that. Can they borrow it? And certainly Jean-Francois doesn't think that they can do that. I think it would be difficult for them to borrow that type of money, you know, which I had estimated that an IPO would get them about $80 billion, and so.
Yes,
Question
here's a
about
mic.
Dave.
Tell us who you are, please.
Dave Onspuck, retired. I have a question about the Sharia law in Saudi Arabia. Do you sense that, you know, in Iran, I've heard about cases where when religious police try to enforce the Sharia law in Iran, there's been popular resistance to the police in Iran. And like, you know, the Sharia law is not universally supported in Iran. But do you see that the popular support for the conservative religious culture in Saudi Arabia, for example, the bans on the woman driving, the male guardianship, the punishment of the gays and the feminists and the dissidents and the religious minorities and all that stuff. Do you see a popular support for that in Saudi Arabia more so than in Iran, or do you see is it a top-down government enforcement thing without the population having a lot of support for it? That's my question. Thanks.
I think there is to speak about the kingdom, I really honestly cannot speak about Iran, but in the kingdom there is very much a generational switch. The young folks are taking over, 50%, 70% of the population is below the age of 30. And some of the young people are Islamist and fairly strong feelings about, Al-Qaeda and all that. But by and large, the vast majority of the young people do not or resent the very strong hand of the religious establishment. And one of the...
Do resent? Or?
They resent
Yeah, okay.
the religious establishment. And I think Mohammed bin Salman has made a lot of hay out of that. He's been able to get support from the young people because he has curbed extensively the religious police in Saudi Arabia. If you go to Saudi today and you go eat in the restaurants, You don't see the rest of the religious police anymore. They're hiding in their white Toyota trucks there, and they have the AC on, and you never see the face of them. And that is extremely popular. So I think in that sense, the Sharia law, of course, is still the law of the land. I mean, it's the constitution of Saudi Arabia. But there is a lot of changes today in the commercial law taking place. The family law is still the Sharia law, and that's not going to change very rapidly. And it's the Sharia law under Hanbali rule, and it's very conservative. But by and large, the young folks are against it today. I mean, against the application of the Hanbali application of the religious law. And Farid, you've lived there not so long ago yourself. So, what did you think?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that he tapped into the sentiment among the youth that who did not want those restrictions. Women driving a little bit makes society a little bit more pleasant. And they also translated that into economics. He said, look, why do we lose all this money with our citizens going to Bahrain to see a movie? Why don't we just capture that money here and have malls and, a little bit freer culture? Cafes and, it was in many ways a very dreary culture in general. And as 75% youth, you can imagine that he tapped into that. He also tapped into a certain level of nationalism and played on that with Yemen and other sort of adventures. So he's also been playing other symbols with the youth. But this is a fairly traditional society, and I think those elements of sort of traditional elements will remain, slowly transform themselves over time if he is successful in transforming the economy, etc.
But you think there is popular sentiment for keeping the conservative religious culture going? Popular.
Yeah, I think there's a certain constituent element in the country that wants that, and he has to sort of tread lightly and
Yes.
Good evening, Sanjin Choi, Langham Partners. Thank you so much for lucid and succinct remark. The Saudi Arabia will take over G20 presidency next year, and I was wondering whether you have any views what the priority ought to be. You both of you speakers mentioned about 70% population under age 30. So with the Saudiization of the policy, what are the impact on youth unemployment in Saudi Arabia? Thank you very much.
what is the impact on? Youth unemployment.
There has been, of course, I mean, most of the changes are taking place because the leadership realized that you cannot have 25% of the young people unemployed. And that was just not feasible. So but they have a fundamental problem, is that if you want to employ young Saudis, you can do that. But that means you have to get rid of the foreigners. There are 10 million foreigners in Saudi Arabia, and most of these foreigners have mid-level jobs, low-level jobs, high-level jobs. You can replace the Saudis at any level. You could put Saudis in there at any level. The problem is that if you replace, especially in the mid-level and low-level, you can replace them with Saudis. But if you do that, you, surprise, surprise, have to pay them. People want to work for wages and proper wages. And if you, let's say a truck driver, when I lived in the kingdom in the late 70s, every single truck driver in Saudi Arabia was a Saudi. You go to Saudi Arabia today, every single truck driver is Indian or Pakistani. And why? Because you know, an Indian or a Pakistani truck driver makes $5,000 a year. 5,000 or so, right? A Saudi to do this kind of job, which any Saudi could do, they used to do it, it will ask for $40,000 or $50,000 a year, just like any trucker in this country. And the trucking companies cannot afford that, because if they did, they'd have to raise the prices, and it would create inflation and so on. So it is very hard for them to say, we want the young Saudis to work, but then we get rid of the foreigners, but then we have to pay them a lot of money, which means the quality and the price of the services will decline. Now, the answer of the Ministry of Labor and Mohammed bin Salman was, that's okay, we'll just bring good jobs at big wages and mostly in technology. But most of the jobs are not in technology. I mean, you have some good jobs in technology, and the Saudis will take them and they'll get paid very nicely. But the real jobs are in industry and in the services. And those, you have to compete with Indian wages. And that's not going to happen. Now, what they started doing is making life very difficult for the private companies and not renewing visas and so on. There's 1 million foreigners left Saudi Arabia last year. So now you go to Saudi Arabia and you'll see a lot of young Saudis working in services. At Kentucky Fried Chicken, you'll have Saudi servers. And you'll have in the hotels, at the desks and so on, you'll see Saudis. So this is happening, but the cost to society is very high, because now all of a sudden the companies will make a lot less money. So the private sector has to agree, and that's one of the things they have not agreed on. They don't want to pay Saudi wages to Saudis. They want to pay Indian wages to Saudis. And that is really where we have a lot of tensions between today the bureaucracy and the Crown Prince on one side and the private sector on the other side. But the writing is on the wall. It will happen more and more. So they are trying to, one of the things they've done, and it was key to this, is they brought women into the workforce. And today, as if my figures are correct, about 30% of the workers in Saudi Arabia are females today, which is from nothing 10 or 15 years ago, a couple of percentage points. So this is really changing very rapidly as well, because the women in Saudi Arabia tend to be more educated, have better diplomas than the men. And they probably are less hungry in terms of salary as the men. I mean, let's face it, it's not very nice, but that's the way it is in the kingdom today. So this is happening. So they are reducing the unemployment among the youth. But it is also creating pressure, definitely, on society, because, as I said, people get not as good services for a lot more money.
Just to give you a couple of anecdotal points. So, like it was easier to get women in to the workforce because they were confined at home, and they wanted to supplement incomes. Incomes have not been rising in Saudi Arabia in real terms. And this was, in some cases, doubling the income if women went to work. And one of the areas they opened up, interestingly enough, was cashiers at supermarkets and at stores, which I thought was interesting because that's an upfront, job. It's not a backroom job. But another one that Aramco actually took a pioneering role in, it created with Tata of India and GE, it created a huge call center in Riyadh for women and hired 1,000 women. And because that was convenient, that they could be behind the scenes, and actually they have plans to do, or maybe they've already done it, a second one. So that call centers in Arabic became a big employment place for women. So they have been trying through ways to creatively, get around the private sector restrictions, create niches for employment. But it's fundamentally incredibly difficult, and mainly because the skill levels are so low. The educational systems were so horrible, and they just don't have people with knowledge. I mean, in sharp contrast to Aramco, which grooms its cadre from high school and then sends them to US universities, and the quality of the people at Aramco are off the chart. And it's sort of in this island And in a funny way, I think MBS has dreams of creating many Aramcos in Saudi Arabia. It's going to take a little bit of time. One other point that I want to make, you brought up the G20, and this is something that, from a foreign policy point of view, the Saudis have really tried in the last 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 years under MBS, to diversify their foreign relations. China was a no-brainer. It's the big market for energy, oil, etc. But Russia was, I think, a surprise, and working with Russia on OPEC, and then working with them on other issues, Syria and then you're seeing them. So the old sort of marriage to the United States, where everything was U.S., whether it was the phone company or the jet fighter or the whatever, construction company, it always was an American company. And now that has been really diversified over the last 5 years. And economy drove it, but there's a big geopolitical element. I mean, it was not coincidental that MBS, after his problems with the Khashoggi affair, would then be treated so well at the last G20 and the handshake and the this and the that with Putin. And then, his very successful visit to India just recently, where he gets a big bear hug, and then he goes to China, and he gets, treated very well. So he's finding comfort in a way, interestingly enough, the Gulf, which turned its back on Asia. The currency in the Gulf was, up to 1966, the rupee. The Gulf and then went off and started playing with the West, and now is coming back and saying, let's play with the East. I mean, there is, in Gulf culture, there is quite a lot of racism against Asians. And that, I think, economics is kind of teaching them other things.
I will mention something on the skills, though. You mentioned that their skills are very poor. But that's not my experience, really. I mean, yes, skills are poor, but because the education is very bad. But then again, how many engineers do we produce in this country? Everybody has a political science major nowadays, and that makes it hard to get a job if you're a political scientist. But otherwise,
But before Trump, we could import them.
that's right. That's right. But I think the key issue in Saudi Arabia, especially in Saudi, is wages. And if the Saudis are paid proper wages, you'll get good work out of them. And
Yeah.
I think
Oh,
that's a lot of the young Saudis don't want to work because it costs, they cannot make a decent living. I mean, they need a living wage, as we say here. And if they don't have that, then why work, And I find that today, going to Saudi Arabia, you find that in the services, people are paid more or less well, and therefore they're willing to take jobs that are not fancy. The main thing is you can tell your mother when you come home that you have a paycheck. That's really what matters. It doesn't really matter what you do. So I think in the end, that is really hopeful that it will happen this way. But you still have over 10 million foreigners out of 20 and 21 million locals.
Well,
now, it's nothing compared, I mean, this is really good compared to the UAE,
But I want to say one thing on that. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you and I were in Bahrain.
Yeah.
I remember the story, and I think it was your friend who told me this story. So they did some reforms on labor market reforms.
Yes.
And they wanted to have all small construction companies hire locals. And inevitably, they had to raise prices to those little companies. And what happened is that actually Bahrain does not have a middle class that could afford higher prices. It's a poor country, and many construction companies went bankrupt because they just couldn't hire Bahrainis at higher prices. So there's a whole structural issue here. It's not just businesses being greedy. It's the market at times cannot take because incomes really have had at least till, well, for the most part, have stagnated, especially in poor places like Bahrain.
Yeah, and Saudi wages are not very high
No.
by any standard. I mean, You know, university salaries are quite low compared to this country. I mean, that's a little bit surprising, but so it costs money to survive, and if you don't have a decent salary, it's very difficult.
Some people can afford Leonardo da Vinci's, but most people can't. You know, so-
So it doesn't have to be a real Leonardo da Vinci.
In the back. Yeah.
Hi. Has Aramco expressed?
Tell us who you are.
Yes, I'm John Hurst. I'm a recent graduate from Vanderbilt University. I was curious whether or not Aramco had plans to invest in alternative energies, like similar companies like Exxon, who kind of, in order to move with the trend away from fossil fuels.
Yes. There was talk both in Aramco and also, I think they had a big project. I don't think it's going anywhere right now, but with, no, the one with the Japanese investor, a huge $200
the
billion
SoftBank.
SoftBank, yeah.
Yes.
So and Aramco itself wants to get into renewables, wind and solar. But I think that space will be left to others, you know. Aqua is a company, a power company in Saudi Arabia that is interested in that, among others. So, and I think MBS wants that too, to diversify away.
Aqua is a very interesting company. Aqua is a large energy company, but they don't provide energy, they build energy plants. That's what they do. They engineer the plants, they build the plants worldwide. And they don't only do renewables, though. They're
Right.
very good
No,
at
no,
renewable. In fact, the lowest bids in the world today in Jordan were from Aqua in terms of megawatts price, dollars per megawatt hour. And that has been very interesting. But Aqua is private, and unfortunately, now they're under pressure to sell to PIF. And I think that's ridiculous, because it really should be private sector only. And the public investment fund basically is going to make it into a big bureaucracy, and I think that's a mistake. But they have that kind of, more and more in the Gulf. Now you have private firms go into the renewables, and they go in a very aggressive way in renewables, to a point where the aggressiveness is a little bit ridiculous, because yes, they can go in solar. It's very easy to produce cheap solar, but how do you manage at night? And they have not resolved yet the storage issue. And that's where Saudi Aramco could really be of use.
And I heard also the sand issue.
The sand,
Sand
yes.
is really debilitating, coating the solar cells.
Yes, that's right. But so they are going in a pretty big way on that. But there's still quite a long way to go. And Saudi Aramco would like to do it. But it's more the Ministry of Energy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I
They-
think the ministry is open and stirring in other sectors,
Right.
including solar.
Yeah.
I wanted to just mention sort of one other possible new investment in the Saudis. This has been reported in the press, are interested in nuclear power. And there are some discussions with American companies as well as other foreign companies about getting approval, and the process is somewhat complex, to order nuclear plants. In the U.S., you have to have a government-to-government agreement, and there are going to be some possible restrictions on enrichment and reprocessing to go along with any kind of U.S. Contract. The Saudis may or may not accept that. But the apparent interest in nuclear power is, again, to diversify the sector, and I guess in the end, to make sure they can sell more oil internationally rather than using it domestically.
Well, the nuclear is a very interesting issue. The Saudis have really basically climbed down. They were planning to have 27 plants at one point. They're down to 2 and probably 0, in fact, because they're watching what's happening in the UAE, and the the 4 plants in the UAE are late, and no one knows when they'll be ready. And the Saudis realize that if they want to be nice to Trump, they have to go with the American technology, which is actually now owned by the Japanese, but that's another story. But it's American technology, so they have to sign a 1-2-3 agreement, and I can assure you the Saudis will never sign a 1-2-3 agreement with the US, ever, because it is one of the basics of Saudi industrial policy is they want to control the technology. If they cannot control the technology, they don't do it. So that leaves the French, the Russians, and the Chinese.
Koreans.
But the Koreans, American technology.
The one in UAE?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that's why they signed the 1-2-3 agreement. So the French will not sell the technology either, so it leaves the Russians and the Chinese, which means it leaves the Chinese. So the Saudis are totally at the mercy of the Chinese, and I think the Chinese know that. So we're not going to see any. I think the Saudis hope they will solve the whole issue of storage of nuclear of solar before they have to sign anything with the Chinese. We'll see how that goes. But it's very it's a complicated story. But I would put at least $5 on the fact that the Saudis will never sign a 1-2-3 agreement in Congress here. $5 whole.
Other questions? Let me ask one back on OPEC politics, maybe to Fareed. Could you say a little bit more about the attitude to the Saudis in cooperating with Russia on maintaining production and price levels? Could that ever be formalized in any way? Is it only informal? Does it work? What's your perception?
Does it work? Yes, it did. It did work from a perception point of view. Whether whether the Russians really lived by the agreement and cut production, no, they didn't do any of it. In fact, from 16 to 18, the only people that really cut were the Saudis. So,
But more recently, I've read that maybe the Russians did cut
they restrained from going up, and they didn't cut that, and because many of their companies had actually expanded capacity, and so they were chomping at the bit to raise production. And so when they declared victory, was it last year, that they said we've got our $65, $70 price, and it looks like it's going even higher, and they said open up the taps, then the Russians did go up, and they've stayed up. It's a marriage of convenience. I don't think it'll ever be formalized into anything real with the Russians joining OPEC. It doesn't really matter. But the swing producer is Saudi Arabia, and it will stay that way going into the future. And maybe at one point they can't go below 10 million barrels a day. It gets just too onerous on their system to do that. So then they may impose some curbs on others, and they get into a fight with OPEC again, and that's the discipline, And you get a period again where prices fall, and then all the OPEC guys come together and pretend like they're cooperating, and then we go back into that cycle.
I think part of the problem has to do with Iran as well, because the Russians are really wonderful at playing Saudi Arabia against Iran.
Well, no, if you look at Russia, it has been masterful in what it has done in the Middle East in the last 5 years. If you look at it, I thought, why would the Russians stake their claim to Syria? Okay, what's second prize here? From a geostrategic point of view. And from what I can gather, it's Syria gave them Europe. Because you want to get your refugees back, you need to have Syria settled again. And gave them the geopolitical relevance. With Israel, it was, you want us to curb the Iranian activity in Syria? We'll do it for you. So be good to us. With the Saudis, you've lost in Syria, so butt out, but we'll help you with your oil price. With Turkey, you want us to curb the Kurds, we can work on that together. And with Iran, all of the above. You know, we can protect you, give you air cover in Syria, we can provide an alternative, some economic assistance, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Russia, Lavrov and Putin have played a brilliant strategy. And now, what will they succeed? I don't know. But I think that they have so far injected themselves in different ways to make themselves relevant. And playing a role that the U.S. never could play, interestingly enough, in its breadth and width.
Yeah.
Since I see no hands, maybe we will close at this point. We do have a little reception for those of you who get to stay on and have a glass of wine. But please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you.